Day 9. The war continues. Ukraine defends itself, strikes back, while the Russian economy falls into an abyss not seen in decades.
Дорогой фондовый рынок, ты был нам близок, был интересен. Покойся с миром, дорогой товарищ.
Let's start with the operational situation. After 2 consecutive days of the war, the dynamics of the events seem to have slowed down somewhat. Russia has not made significant progress for a long time. The war situation is on the southern front, where the fortress of Mariupol, the last link Moscow needs to have a land connection with Crimea, is still defended. The nearby Volnovakha is also important. The Ukrainians are also fiercely defending there. The only major city occupied by the Russians remains Kherson, although there is expected to be some fighting in the city. The offensive on Nikolaev and Voznoshinsk was repulsed. Kharkiv continues to defend itself, though it still threatens encirclement. It seems that the best situation is on the northern front. Not only did the Russian offensive stop there, but the Ukrainians launched a counter-offensive near Makarov and inflicted heavy losses on the Russians. However, the Russians are transferring new reserves to the region. Chernihiv is also bravely defended. Therefore, as the Ukrainian analyst Butusov notes, the key is now the south, and in particular the battles for Mariupol, Voznoshinsk, Kherson, Mykolaiv and Zaporozhye, and the nearby nuclear power plant there. Why are the Russians better off in the south than in the north? It seems there may be several reasons. First, it is drier in the south. Almost all pictures of Russian vehicles and tanks bogged down in the mud are from the north. Second, in the north, the Ukrainians are better supported by NATO reconnaissance. The alliance has excellent airborne and satellite radio-electronic intelligence over Ukraine, where Russian air defense radars are not working in real time. And that's where the Ukrainians are directing TB2s, aviation and artillery. This also explains the recordings of Ukrainian attacks on Buk or Tor missile systems. This reconnaissance may be better in the north, where it is closer to NATO borders. Third, in the south the Russians have shorter lines of communication from Crimea, and it was easier for them to maintain supplies, whereas in the north these lines are constantly interrupted by Ukrainian light infantry. Finally, there are increasing indications that the Russians had a well-developed plan to attack from the south, from Crimea and in the Kharkiv direction, while it may have been enriched at the last minute by an attack on Kyiv. Not only did this delude the troops prepared for their southern attack, but troops attacking Kyiv are totally unprepared and act without a plan, which is being meticulously exploited by the Ukrainian armed forces. The Russians are venting their frustration and continuing to commit war crimes by shelling residential areas with artillery, airstrikes or cluster bombs. What are the prospects for the next days of fighting? The Russians still have the operational advantage. Taking Mariupol and closing the southern direction will make many things easier. On the other hand, every day the Ukrainians are conscripting new recruits into the army. Perhaps they still have some reserves of contract troops. The Russians, on the other hand, according to American intelligence, have already incorporated 92% of their prepared forces into combat. The Russian reserves are shrinking. In addition, all the time there is ongoing topic of the International Legion, and according to recent reports, it is currently estimated at 16,000 soldiers. 16,000 is a lot, and we have to take into account that the information comes from the Ukrainian side. Nevertheless, in many Western countries we can hear voices of soldiers or ex-soldiers saying, "Ukraine stands strong, we are coming." Sabotage and diversionary actions, on the other hand, are ongoing in Belarus, specifically against Belarusian railroads, and are aimed at stopping or delaying Russian deliveries to the Ukrainian border. It is also impossible not to raise the issue of morale again. If the Ukrainian army had not withstood the first blow and dispersed, as the Russians in a way hoped, a new puppet president would have been sworn in today in Kyiv, and the security situation in the whole of Europe would have been radically different. Despite the fact that it was mainly in the first 2-3 days that the Russians broke into the country, the Ukrainians held out and gave the entire West a compelling argument to impose draconian sanctions and begin more arms deliveries. On the other hand, young Russian conscripts see Ukraine's resistance and are unwilling to die for Russia. More and more video footage seems to confirm the claims that the vehicles are being deliberately diverted into the mud, or the fuel is being burned to have a reason to surrender. Here they themselves admit that they were sent to Ukraine as a cannon fodder. They have no water or food, they sleep in the open air, no one is interested in them. They are exhausted and freezing cold. In Russia, Facebook, YouTube and Twitter are being blocked. The few liberal media are being shut down. And by spreading, quote, false information about the war, one can be charged with up to 15 years in prison. It is possible that martial law will be imposed within days. The increased censorship is another sign that the morale of the Russian military is at rock bottom, and things on the front lines are bad, whereas Ukraine believes in victory. According to a recent poll, 90% of Ukrainians believe in repelling the attack, 98% support the armed forces of Ukraine, and 93% support President Zelensky. This is the result of Kyiv's great information warfare, but without the tough resistance of the Ukrainian soldier, this would have not been possible. All this, by the way, may be about something even greater, which Moscow's geopolitical plans did not take into account when calculating the cost of war. I'm referring here to the power of free Western people, combined with the power of mass media. Seeing what the Russians are doing, every Westerner had a natural need to alert the world. This, in combination with the mass media, created a powerful information wave and thus pressure not only on Western governments, but also companies providing services in Russia. After all, these images were not seen only by presidents and ministers, but also board members, directors, executives, and their wives and children. It is therefore highly probable that they, too, when deciding to withdraw their business from Russia, did not look at the balance of profits and losses, but were guided by emotions. All this led to draconian sanctions and general world condemnation. In a word, everyone in the West, with a phone in hand, became a soldier of the infosphere, serving the Ukrainian cause. However, an example of how well the Ukrainians control the information space on the front line is the fact that we see only the images that the Ukrainians serve us. On the internet there are practically only videos of light Ukrainian infantry with NLOS or javelins. We don't see heavy Ukrainian divisions. However, as Marek Meissner notes on Twitter, they are there and putting up a tough resistance. Russians are also the victims of this message, who, trusting in the lack of Ukrainian tanks or anti-aircraft defense, are falling prey to well-prepared Ukrainian defenses. This shows how important message control is on the modern battlefield. We got further arguments proving the chaos of Russian logistics. The now famous convoy of several kilometers stopped near Kyiv. The reasons are a destroyed bridge, attacks by Ukrainian infantry, but perhaps most of all, logistical problems. Expert Trent Talenko pointed out that the pictures of abandoned Russian trucks with cracked tires suggest that they were not properly maintained. They probably stood in one place for months. Sunlight fell on the tires all the time from one side and the tires on the other side rotted. There are claims that by the third day, at the front, Russian soldiers were running out of food, fuel and ammunition. This is all confirmed by comments made by Americans, quoted by journalist Jack Detch. Citing a source in the defense ministry, he writes that Ukraine is, quote, definitely effectively defending itself against Russian attacks, and the main Russian successes are in the south. Russia has been caught off guard by military resistance and logistical problems. The Americans are not seeing signs that would suggest the involvement of Belarusian forces, although such information has emerged in recent days. And perhaps most importantly, Ukraine still has the vast majority of its aviation, including planes, drones and helicopters. This is really great news, if true. The overall off-the-record message coming from the US and NATO about the Russian operation, despite a year of preparation, is, quote, a complete failure. The Breaking Defense portal, citing Russian sources, states that, quote, there was no tactical plan. We were supposed to deal with resistance if it appeared, although the expectation was that there would be none. and we would take these cities from 1 to a maximum of 4 days. Other sources close to the Kremlin are quoted by journalist Julia Hiofe. Quote, "Everyone is stunned. You can't resign now, and if you do, it's straight to prison." Also of interest are reports from the Times that an anti-war lobby in Russia's FSB tipped off the Ukrainian intel to thwart 3 assassination attempts against Zelensky last week. There are tentative signals from Russia that the war must be ended, such as the head of Lukoil. Sanctions are beginning to take effect, although it must be said that their strength is partially cushioned by raising global prices of oil and gas, which Russia continues to export to the EU and the world. The question remains whether the sale of hydrocarbons alone can cover the cataclysm that the Russian economy is now experiencing. The Moscow stock market fails to open for the 5th day in a row. Fitch and Moody's have changed the rating of the Russian economy to a junk. MSCI reports that the Russia is now uninvestable. A car factory in Tolyatti, owned by Renault Nissan, is closing. 35,000 people will lose their jobs there. IKEA's exit means another 15,000 people out of work. Software providers Microsoft and Oracle have already announced their exit from Russia. This will be followed by hardware manufacturers AMD and Intel. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The list of large companies ending their operations in Russia grows daily. On top of that, an interesting analysis on Twitter about sanctions on the Russian aviation sector was prepared by user Jan Nedvidek. In short, Russia has 3 weeks before its passenger aviation largely stops functioning. This is affected not only by the skies over Europe closed to Russia, but also by the issue of insurance, lack of spare parts, and aircraft maintenance. Problems also await the Russian defense program. The Breaking Defense website also reports. Many Ukrainians have long been associated with the Russian defense sector. Now some of them report that Russia has no more caliber missiles in the strategic reserve. But the problems don't end there. Guidance systems and other critical components consist of 60% foreign imported components. All these are sanctioned. And it is unclear how Russia will produce the new arsenal. The caliber is just the beginning. The KBM factory in Tuwa is physically unable to fill orders even for infantry weapons and ammunition. In a way, all this fits with previous Ukrainian intelligence reports about Russian shortages of supplies and raw materials. But perhaps the biggest blow to the Russians, and one that is little talked about in the media, is the halting of sea deliveries by the world's 2 largest ship owners, Maersk and MSC. Maritime trade is the most important branch of world commerce, and at the moment 2 monopolists stop entering Russian ports, so they effectively halt almost any exports and imports from Russia. On the front, the war is still fierce, and the Russians have the upper hand in many areas, while civilians are dying in murderous shellings. But it is impossible not to see the broader picture of the situation, and this one shows the panic of the Kremlin and the free fall of the Russian economy, which by its scale may even resemble the Yeltsin times.
Polish Humanitarian Action started a special fundraiser to help people fleeing to Poland by the Polish border and needing the most basic things such as food or hygiene products, as well as for the people who are moving inside Ukraine and will be dealing with the most difficult situation in their life. The fundraiser can be supported at the Polish Humanitarian Action website.